When first approached to look at this film, it was not my idea, it was brought to me from another producer. My initial reaction was, I think as a lot of people saying, there have been many films about the Holocaust, is there something new to say, is there something different to say, and why should we say it? And I think there were two main reasons why I went along this route. One was that we are now the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camps. And those who had direct experience and could tell us the story are very few. They have been dying, there are not many left. And it seems that if you are going to tell anything about such an extraordinary event in our recent history, you have to tell it through the eyes of the people who were there and participated. So this was kind of the last chance to have them tell their story rather than historians and commentators and so on. So it seemed that that was a good reason to go along that route. The other reason was that the main focus of this film was not so much about the Holocaust, but was about propaganda and film. And here was a film that had been made in 1945 by a quite eminent team of filmmakers, including Alfred Hitchcock, and it had never been seen. And it's a very curious anomaly in the history of film, the history of the Holocaust, the history of the war, why something that was so important should be suppressed. As a filmmaker, that provoked a curiosity about the process. Why should that have happened? And so with those two combined, it seemed that this was going to be something different and a different way of telling the story, and therefore it was very worthwhile. It's a very curious story, and it's a long story, so I'll keep it very short. But in 1945, in April of 1945, before the war ended, when the revelations of the camps came across to Europe and America, and people saw images and photographs and little newsreel clips, there was a sense of outrage across Europe, from government level down to the population. And the film was commissioned with the background of that outrage. So the team was put together, and as I say, a very good team, and their job was to collect all this material and make the film. Now the film was not in order to show the British, American, French, German public, but was aimed specifically at the German population to show sort of a process of denazification. Let's show them what they've done. Let's give them the evidence on film of what they've done, and let's try and get a reaction from the German people. So that was April 1945. A month later, the war ended. And the whole map of Europe and the whole climate of Europe changed dramatically. So from a government level, a very sort of pragmatic and to some extent cynical government level, the war was won. We've beaten the Germans, we don't need to do anything anymore. And now what our eyes are focused on is the Soviet Union. So here we have a new problem, and the Cold War was beginning. So what we need is harmony in Europe that we can oppose the Soviets with. So perhaps it's no longer a good idea to show a film like this to the German people, because we want them on our side. We want to restructure Germany, which was devastated. There's starvation, also poverty and so on in England as well, but in particular Germany, which had been devastated at the end of the war. And this you know, the thought process was, this isn't a good idea at the moment. There was a new government in England, so Churchill, the sort of war leader, much to everybody's shock, was thrown out in July of 1945. So here, the film commissioned in April, the war ending in May, the government changes in July. The new government is not nearly as sympathetic to the people in the camps around Europe as the old government, because they were worried about Palestine, a new issue. So there was poverty, there was, we need Germans as friends, and there's now the Zionist Palestine issue. We don't want to aggravate that. We don't want these people leaving and going to Palestine. So they sort of, you could see it wasn't a conspiracy, it was just the foreign minister at the time thought this is not a good idea. It's a curious thing that the team that made the film didn't really speak about it ever. And it's a curious thing because you feel this must have been a work of passion. It must have been something they really felt strongly about. And here you have three very senior figures. There's Sidney Bernstein in charge of the film, who went on and founded one of the major TV stations in the UK. There is Alfred Hitchcock, who had never been involved in documentary until this film. And there was Richard Crossman, who wrote the script and who became a major politician in England after the war. Not one of these three spoke about the film after the war. And it was only in the 1980s, when an autobiography was being written about Bernstein, that people suddenly realized the film existed. There's no real explanation for why they didn't talk about it. I think the general feeling is that there was a certain sense of disappointment and shame that something that had been so important to them got squashed. But why they didn't make a fuss later on, no answer to. About 3 years ago, the son of Sidney Bernstein died in the 1990s, early 90s. His son is a lawyer, runs a foundation, and the foundation that he runs decided that this film should be completed as his father originally wanted it. So he gave money to the Imperial War Museum for them to put together a team and to find the missing pieces of film, use the script, re-record it, and complete the film as Sidney Bernstein wanted in 1945. So they've been working on that for 3 years, and they've now just about completed the film now. A producer who was working in the Imperial War Museum heard about the story and thought this would be interesting as a film and brought it to us. So once we went and spoke to the people in the Imperial War Museum, we collaborated with them to use some of their film in order to tell the background story of the whole thing. The material that was used in the original film was not structured by the cameraman or anybody for cinema or documentary. It was news imagery done by army cameramen for the different armies, the American army, the Soviet army, the British army. And it was really done not as art, it was done as a form of evidence collecting, because everybody knew there would be trials after the war, everybody knew we'd need evidence, we couldn't just have written reports, and for the first time during war, film had suddenly become an important element. Not in the First World War, but in the Second World War, suddenly film was important. And so in 1945, the material, the evidence on film was being gathered really almost just as it was taken from the different camps, from the different armies, from the different teams, put together as best they could, because it wasn't structured in a way that a filmmaker would have structured it. It was news reporting, film what you see, film what's happening. Now, a generation later, we're looking back and we're in an era now where any time an event happens, somebody will pull out their phone or their thing and you would take the image and you would see what was happening. In 1945 that was very rare, and it was only this material that became the real catalyst for being able to tell the next generation or that generation what had happened during that war. So it was new to the population to be able to see this material. It was shocking, and it was also, the camps footage was different to any other footage, because when the armies filmed war, they didn't really want to tell stories of horror. So you have a battle and you've got a cameraman there. The shots are usually very broad, you see things happening, you see the heroism of some of the soldiers, but you don't see the blood and the thunder. That started coming in during Vietnam and wars like that. But in the Second World War, that's not how war was filmed. It was slightly distanced and slightly anesthetized, it was clinical. When they went to the camps, they couldn't do that, because if you're showing, and it mentions in the film, if you're showing evidence, you have to see the evidence. And to see the evidence, you have to see what had happened to people. So suddenly, almost for the first time around the world, people were looking at real horror. They were looking at dead bodies, they were looking at how bodies had been dealt with and discarded, and I mean, it was horrific material. So that was a change in mentality, I think, about imagery, war, and using film like that in 1945. It was a very big change. And ever since, it's got more and more brutal. I mean, war footage has been more brutal, but that was the first time it was properly recorded. 70 years later, we look back on it, it's still as horrific, but it was important because it was the first time a proper genocide had been recorded. And so it's almost irrelevant whether this is genocide against who, whether it was communists or homosexuals or Romanies or Jews or so on. It was man's inhumanity to man that was being recorded there, and that shocked the world really at that time. So even today, I think it's important to remind people of that fact. I feel myself slightly schizophrenic about this. I am by nature an optimist, and one hopes that the impact of imagery can make a difference. Now the real hope for the original film in 1945 was summed up in the last words of Richard Cressman in the film, which he said, if the world doesn't learn from these images, these pictures, then night will fall, which is obviously why I took the title from. And then he says, but hopefully we will have, those of us who live will have learned. And the hope there is that we will have learned a lesson at the end of the Second World War, and like at the end of the First World War, it was going to be the war to end all wars. This will be the war to end all genocides. Of course, it never happened. So there was a hope, there was an aspiration at the end of the war that this wouldn't happen again. And we now look subsequently Cambodia, we look at Rwanda, there are plenty of other instances since 1945 where the lesson of that war hasn't learned. Having said that, the other film that I was involved in recently was Joshua Oppenheimer's film called The Act of Killing, about genocide in Indonesia. And he's a new one now called The Look of Silence. Those films were able to talk about a genocide in Indonesia that most of us had hardly heard of. Sort of a distant genocide that, horrific, but kind of almost unknown. The government in Indonesia today is the same inherited government as was happening in 1965 when the original genocide happened. And of course, immediately the government banned the films. But imagery is so powerful, and in answer to your question really, it started getting through the system, through black market and video and people sending it and Vimeos and so on. So people started seeing it in Indonesia until some of the cinemas started showing it, and the government eventually sort of gave up trying to block it. Only a couple of weeks ago, the army showed the second of those films to the soldiers, showing them something that they need to understand and learn. Now that's a quite revolutionary change in a country like that. So the images were so strong, the population was so prepared now to learn the lesson of the past, that you feel that something like a film can actually make an impact. You know, I think it's far too idealistic, and I'm too old and cynical, I think, to feel that I'm going to change the world with a film like Night Will Fall. But I think in some areas and with some quarters and with a new generation who don't really know about it, it can make an impact. And one hopes that in the future, more and more imagery, more and more understanding about the causes and the results of such horror might change a new population's thinking process for the good, one hopes.